What if being busy is the biggest lie you're telling yourself? Not a small lie, not a white lie, but a lie that you've been telling so long that it feels like identity. I've been podcasting for well over a decade now. In fact, we just celebrated, as we're recording this, a couple weeks ago, our 650th episode of A Productive Conversation, formerly known as the Productivityist Podcast. But I podcasted well before that. Thousands of conversations. We're talking Mics on Mics with my old podcasting partner, Michael Schechter. We're talking the Work Awesome podcast. We're talking iterations of my solo podcast, Productivarty, where I would do solo episodes, but also have guests on as well. We're even going back further than that to things like Discultured, which was a Canadian pop culture show that I did with my friends Anthony Marco, Shane Burley, Andrew Curry. And there's some people who actually have made friendships with that discovered me through that podcast. And that was not even related to time management. And then my very first podcast was called Effing the Dog. It was based on my productivity parody stuff that I started with, eventually turned into eventualism. If you go searching around archive.org, if you're really curious, you can find those ones. But I've had more than 1,000 conversations about productivity, specifically across multiple shows. And I can tell you that the number one thing people get wrong isn't their system. It's not their tools. It's not even their habits. It's this. They've confused motion with meaning. Now, being busy feels productive. It looks productive. I'm looking into this idea of performative productivity, for example. And other people, because other people see you as being busy and they think you're just crushing it, right? But busy is a disguise. And today I want to pull that disguise off. And that's what this episode is all about. My name is Mike Barty. This is A Productive Conversation. And this is a solo episode. So it's just me thinking out loud with you about what I would call in this instance intentional productivity. Not productivity as a system, not productivity as a set of tips or tricks, productivity as a philosophy, as a way of living. I have a whole other word for this, but we're going to call it in this instance intentional productivity. If you've been following my work for a while, you know where this goes. But if you're just listening to me for the first time, stick around. I'm also doing this today because next week I'm sitting down with Mark Manson. And if you know Mark's work, well, you know he has a lot to say about what actually matters in life versus what we convince ourselves matters. So this conversation is going to be sharp, and this episode is kind of my way of setting the table for it. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, busy is a disguise. You know, you've probably heard the day, if you don't set your priorities, I'm going to butcher this a bit, but when either you run the day or the day runs you. And I think that that's something to keep in mind. Like when you're busy, your schedule runs you. But when you're intentional, you run your schedule. By the way, notice I didn't say time runs you. Not a huge believer in the fact that you can manage time. You can manage your schedule. You can manage your calendar because those are ways that time are framed, but you can't manage time. In its core, some of the roots of busy originally meant anxious or occupied with worry, but we've kind of turned it into a badge of honor. There was an essay a number of years ago by Tim Creeder called The Busy Trap. Went viral. People loved it. But this kind of leans into that, right? There's this cultural glorification of busy, hustle culture, for example, a grind culture. The idea that if you're not exhausted by the end of the day, or even every single day, then you're not trying hard enough. There is a short that I've done recently as part of a series of shorts called One Word at a Time. And if you're on YouTube right now, you can check it out. And if you're not, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But it's called Busy as a Disguise. And it's, as of right now, of all the limited amount of shorts that I've done, it's one of my most popular. So we're going to pull that thread a little bit further in this episode. Most people aren't really productive in that sense. They're just occupied. If we're looking at it from the framing of busy. With that in mind, because there's a massive difference there. We want to kind of move away from that. I want to think about a time, and there's been many, where I've got that wrong. And the thing is, it's not like it's a one-time thing. We often fall into this trap, even when we know better. So when I've been working on books or writing or doing major projects, I will and have look for other things to do that push up the quantity of the amount of things that I've done during the course of a day to make me, quote, busy. But those things could have waited. They weren't necessary to do, or they were a rabbit hole that I went into, right? You start you're putting together a slide deck, for example, and then you find, oh, well, I could fine tune this, or I could do this with it. And all of a sudden you've gone from like the core element of the thing that you were going to do to you've been diverted, or you've diverted yourself. And now all of a sudden you've shifted into, as long as I keep myself busy, then I can earmark that as being productive. And it's happened to me on multiple occasions, and not just, when I was younger or when I wasn't doing this kind of work. It still happens when you're doing this kind of work. I mean, I'm human. We're all human, right? It's just the pause, the stopping, and I did a short video about pause as well, but that pause for a second, just to quote, ask yourself, like, is this really what I should be doing right now? Like, is this truly productive? The tug of war between time and space, while they work together, when humans interact with it, they don't feel, especially when they're busy, that space is something that they can kind of afford. So they either fill it with something, or they don't use it wisely. The idea of rest and things like that. So when this happens to me, and when it's happened, I'm sure to you, the quality of your outcomes or your output can suffer. And I'm not talking about simple things like spelling errors or whatnot. I'm talking about like, oh, there's this part of the message I wanted to convey here, or I was rushing through it so quickly that I missed some of the nuance. I didn't get a good read on not just the project, but the people around it. And then all of a sudden you go to deliver it and it misses the mark, or it doesn't quite land the way you'd hoped. And we're always going to be our own worst critic anyway, right? The most important thing here is to remember that you can't, as we kind of dive in deeper into this, is that busy and productive are not the same thing. You have to do your best to avoid that. And one of the best ways to do that is to just take that pause and look at your intention. So in other words, harness your attention, which you do have agency over, although it admittedly is getting trickier and trickier to do that. Harness your attention towards intention, but you have to set that intention first. So let's look at the word productive here. So the word productive at this juncture, like, it comes from manufacturing, right? Like in Canada, when someone says, productivity, they're not, at least here, they're initially thinking about manufacturing, right? Like that tends to be where people go. Not if you're inside of this space, maybe not, but when you are looking at an organization, they're looking at productivity from a manufacturing standpoint. If you go back to like things like motion theory and the Gilbreths and all of that, you're really talking about measuring machine output. The original film Cheaper by the Dozen goes into this, not the Steve Martin version, but the original version. It's actually based on the real story of the Gilbreths and how they were really trying to measure outputs. They were looking at things like efficiency, but to the nth degree. If you watch that film now, you'll realize that not a lot has changed at that front. You're measuring things that maybe don't necessarily need to be measured to that degree, but there are some things that you definitely need to. There's nuance there, right? But you're not a machine. I'm not a machine. We're now living in a world where we have machines that can do things for us. But remember, machines do not have values. They don't have limited energy to a degree. Like, you can take a computer, turn it off, turn it back on. I actually am quite fond of the fact that I think is it Anthropic, Claude has like, there's a certain amount of time that you can use it until, if you're on a paid plan or whatever, where you've used the limit and you have to step away for a while, because it actually forces you to step away. I mean, the machine doesn't really need the rest. It's obviously there's another system at play here, but you do. If the machine can keep going, you almost feel this this idea that you can keep going as well. Machines don't really need rest, and they don't need meaning either. So when you apply machine metrics to human beings, that's where it really starts to go wrong. That's where intentionality comes into play. Because I'm a firm believer that productivity isn't about being efficient and effective. Those are byproducts of being productive. Productivity is the active link between intention and attention. And it's a loop, right? I intend to do this. I'm going to give attention to it. Then there's action and reflection pieces. There's all these things that are happening in the background, which make us feel like we're probably machines, but there's human elements to it. The problem is that if we have all of this attention but no intention, then what we're doing is aimless and directionless. So attention without intention is aimless. But intention without attention is powerless. So when you are devoting your attention to something completely different that you didn't intend to do, then you're going to wonder, how in the world did I get here? And then you're going to look at your list. Maybe you're going to do some journaling, some reflective practice, whatever. And you're going to say, well, how come I didn't get this stuff done? These are the things I intended to do. You gave them nothing. Therefore, there was no power behind them. They could not be driven forward. You need to have that active link. Once you do that, then yes, you become efficient, effective. But you have to have that there first. So really what we're talking about here is doing the right things at the right time, in the right way, for the right reasons. See, that's another thing too, that efficiency kind of gets wrong. And I did a short video about efficiency too, is that it's more about speed than anything else, right? Like, we're going to focus on speed first and then everything else falls second. But if you miss this other equation of doing the right things at the right time in the right way for the right reasons, and that's the key part, that last part, you're missing the point. So the key part in that whole equation I just mentioned is for the right reasons. That's what most productivity systems completely ignore. So you can have the perfect system and still be living someone else's life. One thing about time crafting is when someone asks me, how do I, I'm going to theme my days, or I'm going to, like, Mike, what do you think I should do? I'm like, well, I'm going to give you the guidelines, the directives. They're inside the, of course, the Productivity Diet, my book. I dive more deeply into time crafting, but I can't tell you what days to theme. I can't tell you what those themes should be. That they're uniquely yours. All I can give you is kind of the scaffolding, and then you apply the specifics, right? And you don't want to be too specific either, because the more specific you are as humans, the more likely that drift could occur because, I can't do this right now, or I don't have the resources to do this right now. So there's a lot in there. It's, and if we're not doing the things for the right reasons and we have the system in place, then we're just really processing a life, processing work instead of doing really good work, meaningful work, living a life. There's a difference between managing time and crafting it. I mentioned earlier that managing time is not the way to go because it's bigger than us. It's been around before us. We are terrible at understanding the passage of time. Time is a man-made construct, at least chronological time. You've heard of this. There's Kairos time. I mean, if you dive deep into this, you recognize this. But managing implies control, right? And crafting, really what it does is implies intention and creativity. And not only that, it's something that you're going to continuously do. Someone doesn't stop practicing their craft. If they do, then they're no longer a craftsperson. So if you're crafting your time, you don't stop crafting your time until you have your relationship with time, at least on this plane, is over. Gentleness isn't the right word, but I'm going to use it here anyway. There's a gentleness to it. There's a humanness to it that allows us to understand that managing time is not the same as directing it. And crafting is actually closer to that. When you think about an artist who's taking some clay and they're molding it, they're not managing that clay. They're crafting it, and they're directing it in a lot of ways to what it will become. And if you ever watch Bob Ross videos, I joke about them, and there's been lots of parody and comedy around it. But when he finishes a painting and he goes, I'm just going to add this little thing and this little thing and this little thing, it just shows that depending on the person, it can never quite be done. So I think it's really important, if you're going to try to kick busyness to the curb as much as possible, that you understand that time isn't something that you manage, it's something that you craft. And when you do that, then you can align your intentions with your attention. And then all of a sudden you're actually being productive. So we're talking about how subtle this can be, because it kind of, unless you really think about it and around all the noise that's going on in this world that we live in now, and this is not new. We've been living in a world that has variations of this for at least as long as I've been alive, and especially as long as I've been practicing this for over 15 years. The reason it's subtle is because intentional productivity isn't loud. Like, productiveness is not loud. It doesn't look impressive from the outside either. What does is getting to inbox zero. What does is checking off as many boxes as possible. What does is motion, moving around, performative productivity, that you can see from the outside. But in, this idea of productiveness, being in this state, being intentional about your productivity, it's quiet, it's subtle. So the person doing deep, meaningful work, well, they often look like they're doing less than the person who's constantly busy. There's a movie called The Pursuit of Happiness that came out a number of years ago, where it's based on a true story. And Will Smith, the character he's playing, Chris Gardner, goes into become an intern, right, for this firm. And I'm not going to go into the specifics because I cannot remember the specifics as I go through it. But the one thing I do remember, he's given a list of potential clients to call. And instead of starting at the bottom of the list, which is the clients that have the least amount of money, which everybody does, he flips the script and starts at the top. And he starts to build those relationships. So while you've got people trying to go through this list from, least impressive financially to most, they're cranking things out. They're transactional. Like that's the transactions they're applying. Chris Gardner, Will Smith in this character are going for relational, right? They're doing quiet work. And what happens? Well, it works. He got the job. He got the job, the paid job, and he needed it. And this was a dream, a goal of his, right? And again, this is the movie, so don't take this as exactly how it happened. Movies love to glamorize things. They love the story of the underdog, as you know. But being intentionally productive, I think it loves the story of the underdog as well. So real productivity, it's quiet. It compounds over time. It doesn't post about itself. That's another thing to keep in mind. Ask yourself, take that pause. Is there another approach? Is there another way? Maybe I should look at, as a night owl myself, I don't do those heavy lifting, intense tasks early in the day. I do them later in the day because that's when I'm at my best. If I'm in an office environment doing that, people might assume, hey, why aren't you doing those big, heavy project work? Because it's not after lunch yet. That's when I'm best at that. Instead, I'm going to do these small, middling or less intense tasks to start off the day. And I have a way to look at my list that tells me what, I've got an up arrow next to the ones that are high energy, so I know they're later. I got a down arrow next to the ones that are low intensity, and that's how I'm going to work through my list. Not sequentially, not based on priority levels that may not really be necessarily accurate, because, having more than one priority kind of dictates that you have none. That's another thing to keep in mind. So how do we stop this? How do we kind of keep the lying eyes of busy at bay? Well, there's 3 questions I think that you can ask every single day. So if you're at this point in the episode, this is where you'll get the things that you need to help take this on. It's interesting because when I was talking to Mark Manson about his podcast and his video series, mainly Solved, at the end of the day, he's not really solving anything. He's discussing it, offering, insights, feedback, but these are things that can never truly be, quote, solved. But giving you different tactics, ways to work through it, I think is valuable. So the 3 questions that you can ask every day, and I've got them written down right here. What is the most important thing I could do today? Changing the phrase from what do I have to do today? I don't like the word have to because it implies that I have no choice. And it can actually, if you don't like what you're doing, it can definitely be a bad way to start off the day. What am I going to do today implies ambiguity. There's no intent behind it. It's wherever the attention takes you. What's the most important thing I could do today is a great question, because you can isolate that. You could put crucial next to it or something like that. Like you could highlight it. You could write it down in all caps. You could highlight it in your task app, whatever you want to do. Another way to look at that question is, if you're into time crafting, is what's today's theme, or what's today? Because today is, like, as we're recording this, today is Saturday. Okay, well, what is Saturday's theme? Saturday's theme is stewardship. Okay, what is the most important stewardship task that I can do today? Because you're narrowing your focus as a result. You're filtering it. And you're filtering it with ease because you know what day of the week it is and you know what the theme is. So the answers are definitely available to you faster than what's the most important thing I can do today. But if you're not into time crafting yet, you haven't spent time with it, you haven't done any sort of time theming, maybe you don't have daily themes or monthly themes or any kind of that in place, then this question, what is the most important thing I could do today, is a great question. The second one is, what would make today feel complete? Not full, but complete. So if you're practicing time crafting, it would be living up to my daily theme. Could be very simple. Like most of my tasks should be oriented around my daily theme. If I do that, then my day would be complete. Others could be, I want to deliver this outcome, this project, whatever, before the end of the day. That's complete. It doesn't talk about all the other things that fill the gaps. So that's another great question to ask. What would make today feel complete? Not full, but complete. And then the third question, what am I doing out of obligation versus intention? It goes back to the first point, like, what do I have to do today? Well, all of a sudden, that's obligation. And you've probably heard the idea of, what do I get to do today? I'm not a big fan of that question either, because not everybody gets to do what they want. But to me, it almost feels, for me, it feels like there's a falseness to it. I'm not always happy when I get up to start the day. And I know leaning towards gratitude and gratefulness is a good idea, but you can't always reframe obligations as opportunities. Again, we're human. But if you can reframe it like, what am I doing out of obligation versus intention? It gives you some of that agency back. It doesn't mean that you won't do things out of obligation. We all have to do things that we don't want to do. Regardless of how successful we are or what our lives look like, you don't get to do everything you want. So this is a great question to ask, because at the very least, even if you are doing a lot of things out of obligation, it does differentiate them, right? Like, this is an obligation. This is something I intend to do. And by the way, as long as you're lining those up, you can intend to do the things you're obliged to do too, which is okay. That's what you want. So those are the three questions. What is the most important thing I could do today? What would make today feel complete, not full, but complete? And what am I doing out of obligation versus intention? So what is the difference between a schedule and a framework? Most people build schedules, boxes of times filled with tasks, your time boxes. But a framework, what it asks is, what kind of day do I want to have? What kind of energy do I need to bring? What kind of energy is available to me? What matters most right now in this season of my life? So we start to think in things of themes over tasks. We can put these things into buckets. So instead of using boxes of time, we use themed periods of time. And the tasks fit in there. So when you theme your days and you theme horizontally, which would be across hours of the day or minutes of the day, you stop context switching constantly, which is another form of busyness, right? You start to batch things in a better way. And there's a distinction between, like, say, horizontal theming, which is the same time over multiple days, versus time boxing, which looks a bit more patchwork, or time blocking. But that's something I go into more deeply in my book. Let's talk about the role of rest in this too, because rest, it's not the opposite of productivity. It's part of the system. Rest is part of the system. I made a short video about that as well. There is a episode that we have of the podcast, which I'll link to in the show notes, called "While Doing Nothing Might Be the Most Human Thing You Can Do." Rest as a productive act, not a reward for being productive. That's episode 652. Might be worth listening to if you're struggling with this idea of rest as part of it, as opposed to a reward. But you can't sustain intentional work without intentional rest. This can't be done. If you're going to change something around all of this starting tomorrow, those three questions are great, but I want you to pick one thing in your schedule this week, that you're doing out of habit or obligation and not intention. Just one thing. And then you can either eliminate it, delegate it, or consciously choose it. That's the key, but you've got to make it a choice and not a default. You may not be in the position to eliminate it. You might be in the position to delay it, which is a form of delegation. You may have a person you can delegate it to. We're talking personal or professional here. So if you've got family members that can help, or friends, or, I can delegate mowing the lawn to my kids, right? Or my son. Kind of hard for my daughter to mow the lawn from Montreal, but nonetheless. So you can eliminate it, delegate it, or consciously choose it. But you've got to make it a choice. You've got to make it a choice and not a default, because that's where this intentionality begins. Then you are truly being productive. What do I intend to do? I intend to mow the lawn on Saturday. Okay, well, how am I going to give attention to that? Well, I just said it. Saturday is my stewardship day. That's when I do that sort of stuff. So on Saturday, it's on my list. And I'll do it early in the day when my brain is not working at 100%. Or I'll do it later in the day because I want my brain working at 100% because I'm going to be operating machinery. As we wrap up this episode, I want to talk about next week and Mark Manson. So on the surface, Mark Manson isn't a productivity person. He's a life philosophy person. But, his work, especially around values, what we choose to care about, and the idea that doing less but better is the path to a meaningful life is deeply aligned with what I talk about, productiveness. And as we talked about today, intentional productivity. And those things are incredibly related. The subtle art framing, it isn't accidental. Sure. It looks nice on a book cover too, along with the expletive. But it's a direct nod to his approach. So next week, when we talk to Mark Manson, we're going to talk about what he actually thinks about productivity culture, whether he thinks it's even broken. We talk about the connection between his work on values and how we spend our time, deep work focus, and what it means to do work that matters, and then whether he considers himself productive and how he defines that. We got into a whole bunch of things, so I encourage you to check out that episode. Now, why does this matter? Because most productivity conversations, well, they're inside the productivity bubble. I'm trying to bring myself out of that to a degree, to have conversations, to talk about stories and bring in examples that don't necessarily come up that often in productivity parlance, so to speak. So talking to someone who approaches it kind of from the outside, that's not his main gig, so to speak, from that philosophical angle, the psychological stuff, and raw honesty, that's going to surface things that a typical productivity conversation just wouldn't. So you can check out the video on my YouTube channel and get a sneak peek at what's going on. But that's going to be happening for episode 655. So I encourage you to subscribe to the show and check it out. But here's what I want you to take away from today. Busy is not a virtue. It's not a badge. It's not even an accurate measurement of what you're doing with your life. Intentional productivity, what it does is it asks a harder question than how much did I get done? It asks, did what I do today move me closer to who I want to be and the life I want to live? Now that question, it's uncomfortable. It requires honesty. It requires you to actually know what you value, which is harder than it sounds. But that's the work. It's not the system, not the app, not the morning routine. The work is knowing what matters to you and then protecting your time and energy accordingly. That's what time crafting is built around. That's what this show is ultimately built around as well. And that's what next week's conversation with Mark Manson is going to dig into even further. Now, new episodes of A Productive Conversation, they drop every Wednesday, both as an audio program on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts, but also on YouTube as an audio version. If you want a heads up when the Mark Manson episode lands next week, then I would subscribe wherever you listen. And if you can't wait for next Wednesday, like I was saying, you could check out the full conversation, unfiltered, unedited. It's already here on YouTube. So go find it, but then come back next Wednesday for the podcast version. It'll be in YouTube as well, but get it wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Mike Vardy. This has been A Productive Conversation. Until next time, remember, stop doing productive. Start being productive. See you later.